All right. We are on Rockford Reading Daily, episode 5. We are reading Mumia Abu Jamal's Have Black Lives Ever Mattered? Let's pick up where we left off. Of Cops and Courts, March 2nd, 2002. Several of the cops convicted in connection with the vicious, brutal, terrorist assault of Abner Louima in a Brooklyn police precinct have been graciously granted their freedom by a U.S. appeals court. Citing insufficient evidence and the ineffectiveness of trial counsel, the state's highest federal tribunal reversed the convictions of Charles Schwartz, Thomas Bruder, and Thomas Wise on conspiracy and civil rights charges. The assault of Abner Louima, as many are aware, was a crime of unmitigated savagery when police wrongfully arrested him, a young black man, outside a nightclub and rushed him, manacled, to a police station in Brooklyn where they rammed a broomstick into his rectum, then took the bloody, feces-covered stick and forced it down his throat, shattering his teeth along the way. No one heard his screams. No one saw his attackers beat, pummel, or brutalize him. No one, not one cop in a place swarming with cops. Far be it from this writer to suggest that the cops should somehow have lesser constitutional rights than the average Joe. The point is, however, that they have considerably more. That such heinous acts of sadistic violence took place at all in modern-day America speaks volumes, and not just about the sense of impunity with which police conduct themselves. That such acts happen in an official government building, a city police station, and no one, to this date, has ever come forward as a witness, also speaks volumes about a society that tolerates its police perpetrating such acts. When cops get busted, they often do so only after a grand jury has charged them. Average folks have a bill of information filed against them. When they do go to trial, they are represented by the best legal talent that money can buy, often paid by their local labor lodge. Average folks must scrape the money together to pay for a lawyer or accept the services of a public defender. If they are convicted, which is exceedingly rare, it is usually on lesser offenses, for more rarely still are they charged with the more serious crimes. And if sentenced, they often get moderate terms, unlike average folks who are deluged with charges and receive heavy sentences. And even in the unlikely event that they are harshly sentenced, there is a profusion of cases involving prosecution of cops who have stolen, lied on the stand, been corrupt or brutal, and yet have had their sentences cut by judges who are not otherwise known for leniency or compassion. From the barbaric brutes of the Los Angeles Police Department to the thieves of the infamous 39th District in Philadelphia, to those who aided or abetted the sick and depraved terrorist attack on a black Haitian in Brooklyn's police precinct, judges have been openly solicitous of state authorities' every right, for, truth be told, they are ever brothers under the robe uniform who look out for each other. And that brings us to the end of that passage. That was a brutal... that was the first thing that I think is just that was a brutal way to murder somebody, a brutal act to do to another human being, to stick a broom up another human being's rectum and then to stuff it down the person's throat in a police station. And again, a lot of people don't realize the deep-seated roots of trauma and violence and corruption that exist in the police department. I think that exists in the institution of policing. I think that a lot of people think these are just one-off acts or things that happen here or there, and people have to be reminded that how often these officers use force on civilians, how very few of them ever have any type of reprimand for that use of force on civilians, and so that puts them in this place of impunity. It builds this culture of impunity that enables, if not encourages them to continue to commit these acts of violence on more civilians. And that is why we have to do the job of changing the perception of policing, is because there are communities, there are people who have a very vast different perception of policing than what the mainstream perception is. There are people who have had their homes kicked in the middle of the night, in the middle of the morning, unjustly, who have had family members imprisoned unjustly and falsely, and all of these things have been done by these institutions of policing and more. And I think that one of the other things that they point out is how the institution of policing is covered up by the judicial system. It's covered up by judges. It's covered up by prosecutors. And it's true. All of these institutions act in accordance with each other. And so it's going to take a full understanding of each of these institutions and how each of these institutions act in conflict of interest to support the other, for us to get to a place of absolving ourselves of these of the corruption within these institutions, and then creating new institutions. I think that that's one of the things I hope that people are taking away as we're reading this, is the importance of creating a new institution outside of policing, because of the inherent violence that has always existed in policing and that still exists to this day. All right, let's go on. Let's move on to the next passage. We Have No Country, October 19th, 2002. Time marks the minds of us all. Every people has its traumas and dates that trigger memories and nightmares. In Panama, for example, mentioning December 20th evokes the dwellings of the poor, laid to waste by the airplanes and land forces of the United States, which staged an invasion of Panama in order to secure perpetual dominance over the Panama Canal, for which the barrios of El Chorrillo were pounded into powder and ash, and thousands were left homeless. For people in the United States, all you need to do is mention, quote, September 11th, end quote, and no more is required. The mind races to images of fire, dread, death, and devastation as traumatic as any endured by survivors of military invasion. Yet September 11th also evokes other memories for other people, for it marks a date when Africans in a hostile America rose up against the misery imposed by their white enslavers and fought back for the bright light of freedom. It was dawn, September 11th, 1851, when a group of slave catchers converged on a farmhouse in a little town called Christiana in Pennsylvania's southeast corner. Present were the enslaver, Edward Gorish, his son, Dickinson, a U.S. Marshal named Henry Klein, and several other armed white men. They thought they were out on just another day's work, the work of enslaving, but they were met by 5 black men and their wives who had no intention of giving up their freedom. Gorish made his demand, telling the now free blacks, quote, "You had better give up," end quote, and adding, "For I have come a long way this morning and want my breakfast. For my property I will have, or I'll breakfast in hell," end quote. William Parker, who had escaped to freedom some 12 years before, had no intention of turning over anybody, and called down to Gorish, quote, "See here, old man, you can come up, but you can't go down again," end quote. Black historian Ella Forbes recounts the events in her stirring work, But We Have No Country, the 1851 Christiana, Pennsylvania resistance. As the posse attempted to enter his house, Parker, quote, met them at the landing and asked, "Who are you?" The leader, Klein, replied, "I am the United States Marshal." I told him to take another step and I would break his neck. He again said, "I am the United States Marshal." I told him I did not care for him nor the United States. At that, he turned and went downstairs, end quote. Parker's position in light of the passage and extension of the Fugitive Slave Act, which threatened all black people, whether fugitive or free, with seizure and a passage into bondage, was simple. What's up? It's not a camera. It's just it's a podcast. Yeah, it's not no camera.
What you reading?
What's up? It's called "Have Black Lives Ever Mattered" by
Oh, shit.
Abu Jamal.
No, that ain't never mattered.
Thank you.
You not gonna go home? It's
not that cold. It's not that cold. And I just came out. I was at home earlier. We take shifts. Sometimes I fall asleep. But we take shifts. Somebody else coming too. Yeah. Bring him on. Yeah. No. It's not Mississippi cold. We was out here when it snowed last year. We take shifts. It's shifts. It's not just. I'm not just staying out here the whole day. Sometimes you take days off. Sometimes you take days off.
It's cold right now.
It's chilly. It ain't cold. It's chilly. Thank you. I love you. Okay. Parker's position in light of the passage and extension of the Fugitive Slave Act, which threatened all black people, whether fugitive or free, with seizure and a passage into bondage, was simple. He said, quote, "The laws for personal protection are not made for us, and we are not bound to obey them. Whites have a country and may obey the laws, but we have no country," end quote. One of the black men in the farmhouse began to weaken, a man named Pickney, who said, quote, "We better give up," end quote. His wife, Hannah, picked up a machete, called a corn cutter, and grimly announced she would cut the head off of the first one who tried to surrender. For a time, Parker and Garouche argued over slavery, and each quoted the Bible to support their views, but each knew that the words would not decide the argument. Parker's wife, Eliza, seeing the necessity of reinforcements, blew her horn to summon members of the black neighborhood militia. As she sounded her horn, the marshal shot at her with a pistol, but missed. As scores of militiamen appeared, the U.S. Marshal withdrew, but the stubborn Garouche and his men remained. The elder said, quote, "I'll have my property or die in the attempt," end quote. He tried, he died. When Dickinson tried, he was shot and wounded. As night fell, Parker and two other black men took to the Underground Railroad en route north. United States President Millard Fillmore, who signed the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act into law, dispatched 45 Marines to Christiana, and they arrested scores of people. 36 local black men and 5 white Quakers were later tried for treason. The men, defended by the abolitionist Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, were acquitted by a jury in 15 minutes. Parker, meanwhile, like thousands of other blacks, made way for Canada after stopping off at the Rochester, New York home of the great black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Historians have considered the Christiana resistance the first shots fired in the looming Civil War. Philip S. Foner has called it, quote, "a major harbinger," end quote, of that war. Let me get to the next page. Christiana proved that the fight for freedom in America would be a fight not merely with words, not merely on paper, but with blood. For millions of Americans of that day, September 11th meant a day that could not and would not be forgotten. And that brings us to the end of that passage. I think some of the things that this is my first time reading this deep into the book, Have Black Lives Ever Mattered by Mumia Abu-Jamal. So this is my first time hearing that story of what took place on September 11th in 1850? I know the Fugitive Slave Act was 1850. I don't know if that was just that quick. I done forgot. That's why sometimes you got to read these multiple. 1851, September 11th, 1851. So that was my first time hearing that story. I think that one of the things that stands out to me is the importance of resistance to injustice and how different people have had to pay different prices for resisting injustice and for resisting oppression and resisting corruption and resisting evil. But the importance for us to resist no matter what the consequences are. And actually, in spite of what the consequences are, I believe. And so that's the main thing that I take away from that, as well as a history lesson of what took place in Christiana. Sorry about that. I'm hitting this mic a little bit. It's my glove hitting the mic. Hold on. Give me 1 second. I'm going to stop this segment, and then we're going to start another segment up in 1 second here. All right? Bear with me. All right. Let's continue reading. This is The Other Central Park Rapes, 2002. Quote, the ideological space for the proliferation of this racialized fear of crime has been opened by the transformation in international politics created by the fall of the European socialist countries. Communism is no longer the quintessential enemy against which the nation images its identity. This space is now inhabited by ideological constructions of crime, drugs, immigration, and welfare. Of course, the enemy within is far more dangerous than the enemy without, and the black enemy within is the most dangerous of all. End quote. Angela Y. Davis. There was, without doubt, a wild and horrific crime committed against a young woman in the green depths of New York City Central Park in the cool nights of 1989. But she was not the only person against whom a crime was committed. 5 boys, Yusuf Salam, Kerry Wise, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, and Antron McKay were each victimized by a judicial system that saw them in the same shallow, racist terms that the media were portraying them. Like most poor folks, the boys were hustled into court and provided with defense counsel that was barely more than a presence. In the days following the Central Park rape, as well as during the trial, Donald J. Trump took out full-page ads in city papers viciously lamenting that these, quote, animals could not receive the, lamenting that these, quote, animals could not receive the death penalty, end quote. The boys were duly bum-rushed to one of the New York State's prison hellholes, where they were tarred with one of the worst of all tags, quote, rapist, end quote. In prison culture, there are few epithets that are more deadly, with perhaps only, quote, baby raper, end quote, being worse. These 5 youngsters endured such of horrific conditions, some of them for over a decade. And when the time came for an elusive false freedom, they faced another hell in the city where their names had become anathema. For as they suffered, so too did their families. The boys' mother recently wrote to the head district attorney and said, quote, we have suffered for 13 years, but it seems like an eternity, while the so-called justice system refused to hear our laments or even objectively review our many legal concerns regarding the many improprieties that we perceive to be evident in this case. It has been our hope, although not our belief, that we will be treated fairly and democratically, given the confession of Matthias Reyes and the forensic verification validating his admissions, end quote. The mothers of the Central Park 5 had endured the unendurable as their boys swallowed up into the gulags and emerged with permanent scars upon their very souls. One wonders what would have happened if Mr. Reyes had not come forward. In a word, nothing. One has to wonder how many other Americans are rushed through a vicarious, greedy, and soulless system to languish in the joint under processes that are virtually identical to those endured by Yusuf Salam, Kerry Wise, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, and Antron McKay. What is most striking about the Central Park 5 is their ordinariness. They are anybody's son in any city at any time. Their fate is not unique. And so the Central Park jogger rape case folds, and it now seems that those boys got raped by judges, by defense lawyers, by prosecutors, by juries, and by, quote, the white nationalist media, end quote, to quote black novelist Ishmael Reed. The very media that sensationalized and demonized the boys 13 years ago and sold ad space to call for their deaths now make new millions off their exoneration. Many ask what went wrong. The question really should be, what is the difference between this case and hundreds, if not thousands, of others? What is the difference? The answer is not much. It happens every day in a nation where the lives of black, brown, and Latino families don't matter. And that is the end of that passage. The first thoughts that come to my mind as I read through that were watching the film I can't on Netflix, the Netflix series about the exonerated five. I think that's what they call them now, instead of the Central Park Five. I think it was They Can't See Us or When They See Us or something like that. I'm sorry that I can't remember the name right now. I'm somebody yelling the name of the show at me. But I remember watching that, and it was one of the most difficult things that I feel like I've ever watched in my life. When it got to the last episode, that was, I believe, about Corey's specific experience. I had did a good job of not becoming too emotional through other parts of the show, but that was like that episode stirred, enough emotion where, I think I cried a little bit. And I remember they had the interview with Oprah or somebody that was on Netflix, and I couldn't watch that. I had already watched the show. I think I heard somebody else talking about how they watched that, and they was crying watching that, and I was just like, at the time it was just, and I think that's one of the other things about this police terrorism, mass incarceration, racial injustice, this three-headed monster, is that it manifests itself in so many different ways. And there are so many people that are inside prisons in this country and inside jails in this country that are innocent of what they are inside those jails or prisons for. There are people who, whether they're innocent through the fact that their trials they had their trials done, and maybe innocent isn't the proper word. There are sets of people that are innocent inside of these prisons and inside of these jails. But there also are people who have had miscarriages of justice implemented upon them for them to be sentenced and put into these jails and these prisons, whether that be not having adequate or equal access to lawyers or having adequate or equal representation by jurors, or whether it be the police department's mishandling of evidence. It's so many things. When you have a system that involves human lives like this, there's so many things that become glitches in the system, and that people become victims of these glitches in the system. And it's not always manifested in a police officer shooting somebody, or a police officer tasing somebody, or a police officer beating somebody up. And a lot of times it also requires us, when you look into some of these macroaggressions, that this is pertaining specifically to mass incarceration, them being falsely imprisoned, you have to find a way to look past what somebody has been convicted of, or what somebody has been charged with or accused of, because these five young men were, accused of rape. And as Mumia Abu-Jamal stated, and as is true in our society in general, that rape and, as he said, baby rapists, that there's a stigmatization that is put on anybody who has those things attached to their names. And so if you want to look and to see, so once you get into a place where you're trying to look to see if somebody has been falsely imprisoned for rape or for child molestation or for whatever action that you think they may be falsely in prison for, or they may be saying they're falsely in prison for, you have to be able to look past that action and see the human being. And I think that we live in a society where you're taught to not do that. You're not taught to look past an action and see a human being. And when we don't have that as a tool that we can use as people, when we don't have that type of empathy that we can tap into, it gets you into a place where it's easy for institutions to charge somebody with something and for people to believe it. It's easy for institutions to group a community together, a group a collective together, and say that this is what these people represent, and for us to believe it, because we see the action first, and then we see the human being and the person second. And I think there's a deeper conversation to be had about that and about all those things. But let's continue on. And to extrapolate it to Winnebago County specifically and to Rockford specifically, there have been multiple people who have been exonerated after being charged by the Rockford Police Department for doing things. There's multiple people that have been multiple people that have sued the city of Rockford and sued Winnebago County for their false imprisonment and have won. And so this is also a macro aggression of mass incarceration specifically that we have seen manifest also here in this city, in this area. When a child is killed, there is something unutterably terrible about the death of a child. The universe seems to pitch and turn and fall into itself where something so unnatural occurs as a child leaving the realm of the living. On Christmas Eve 2002, it happened. Indeed, more than that happened. A 12-year-old boy was shot into eternity on that date, shot by a cop who would later claim that the boy was running, with his hands in his pockets, from a car suspected to be stolen. Putting aside, for a moment, the absurdity of the image of a child running with his hands in his pockets, the state police would later claim that they used lethal force and killed Michael Ellerby because a police officer had fallen down and it was thought that he had been shot. The city of Uniontown, Pennsylvania is a fair-sized town, roughly 150,000 people, located in Fayette County in the southwestern part of the state. The percentage of black people in Uniontown is roughly equal to the percentage of blacks in the nation's population as a whole, but population, standing alone, means little if the people who comprise it have neither representation nor power. There was a coroner's inquest into the killing, but it impaneled an all-white jury. Despite the eyewitness testimony of a young white boy who saw the shooting from his window, the jury and the judge running the show declined to charge the cops with anything. The witness recalled that he saw the two troopers shooting at the boy. A few days later, the local district attorney would announce that she would not charge them with anything. In the wintry weather of February, some 300 Uniontowners and others gathered at the Fayette County Courthouse to protest the tragic killing and to demand justice. Michael Hickenbottom, the boy's father, spoke simply and eloquently to the gathering. Quote, "I'd like to thank particularly God, who blessed each and every one of us to be here today. The Pennsylvania State Police shot and killed my son, and now they're trying to cover it up. I know there's love in this world when I look out and I see all of you here today." End quote. The family has filed a federal lawsuit charging civil rights violations and wrongful death. Some of the marchers expressed anger that nationally known black leaders did not join them in their protest against the Fayette County criminal, quote, justice, end quote, system. Many of the big names were invited, but none showed. Pictures of the child show a boy with a sweet half smile, a knowing glint in his eye, and a sense of the immortality that all children seem to delude themselves with. Once again, the police have set forth the, quote, Amadou Diallo defense, end quote. The, quote, "I thought my partner was hit," end quote, bit. They are allowed the old, quote, "I was just doing my job," end quote, excuse, and are thus able to, quite literally, get away with murdering children. A child is dead, shot in the back by a minion of the state. A black child is dead, a hole burrowed into his heart. Once again, a boy does not live to become a teenager. A child is gone. And according to the law, no one is to be charged for it. A black child is dead again. All right, that brings us to the end of that passage. I think reading through that passage was the first time that the totality of how many of these stories that we just read through has hit me. I also think that as I was reading through this, this made me think of Logan Bell, who was 18 and was killed in Rockford, Illinois, by the Rockford Police Department. He was shot 16 times. He was having a mental health crisis. He had a BB gun. He shot the BB gun. The police officers were aware it was a BB gun. When the police officers were called. They were told he had a BB gun, that his grandmother thought he was a danger to himself and she wanted help. The police would shoot him 16 times after he shot his BB gun and were murdering him. 2 different officers would shoot him. That was one of the thoughts that I had. And then I also thought of little Mike Sago, Jr., who was murdered by off-duty Winnebago County Sheriff Deputy Jeff Pobjecki. It was a thwarted robbery. Little Mike Sago was outside, was essentially the lookout. People would go inside of Marie's Pizza. 3 other people would go inside Marie's Pizza in an attempt to rob Marie's Pizza. Jeff Pobjecki, the off-duty Winnebago County Sheriff Deputy would be inside of Marie's Pizza when this took place. It would be him and the person at the register at Marie's Pizza. There was a gun that was kept in Marie's Pizza that Pobjecki knew about because he frequented Marie's Pizza often. So he would go to get that gun. It would be a struggle between one of the men who came in to rob Marie's Pizza and the person at the cash register at the front desk, in which the person at the front desk would ultimately end up with the gun of the person who came in the attempt of the robbery. Frank Pobjecki would shoot the person who came in with the weapon, who had already been disarmed. He then would shoot the other two people that were inside of Marie's Pizza. In the midst of this happening, little Mike would come inside of Marie's Pizza, and he would be shot while he was trying to run away to get out of Marie's Pizza. He would essentially be crawling away. He was on the ground crawling away when he was shot. Both of these stories, Logan Bell and little Mike Sago, I would implore people to look into themselves, so that way I don't believe I'm mishandling any of the details. But if there is any mishandling of the details, please look into those themselves. I think also, reading through this, it made me think of Tamir Rice, who was 13 and killed by police department in Ohio, I believe is the. And then it also made me think about my own family members, young black boys and young black girls, young black folks. And from the moment that you come into this world as a small child, the specter of violence, hangs over you, and it's there. And there's, of course, in the society that we live in, there's violence that hangs over all of us as a specter in some sense or another. But there's a disproportionate amount of it when it comes to black children and children of color. And it's very disheartening to think about the lack of grace that is shown to children of color in this society. And I think that's going to do it for us for this Rockford Reading Daily of Have Black Lives Ever Mattered by Mamia Abu Jamal. I'll be back tomorrow.